Hello everybody, so my name is Quentin Lippman and I will present today a joint work with Claudia Senik entitled Maths, Girls and Socialism. So as the title indicates it's about the gender gap in maths in socialist countries against Western countries. So since the 90s, girls' initial disadvantage in education has started reversing. There used to be a gender gap in almost any field of study. In the past 3 to 4 decades, this has been largely narrowed. But there is still one field where girls are underperforming and that girls avoid, and it is mathematics. So beyond being intriguing, this gender gap in mathematics has important implications in terms of well-being and for future life. First, it produces anxiety and stress when in school. Second, it leads to lower earnings and occupational sorting because most countries use mathematics as a way to select their best students into the best schools. And finally, as noted by Hanushek and Kimko in 2000, as the number of people good in mathematics in a country is positively associated with economic growth, the gender gap in mathematics could lead to lower economic growth. So since this is quite problematic, it adds the question to where does it come from? Can we do something about it? Why is it there? So in the literature, there are two sets of arguments on this. There is first the researchers that believe that it is natural. The brain of girls and boys they have different brains, and the brain of boys happen to be more fitted for mathematics than the one of girls. And as such, the gender gap in mathematics is just produced by nature, and there is not much we can do about it. But opposed to this set of arguments, there are a lot more of researchers that believe that the gender gap in mathematics is acquired through life. It could be a rational response to unequal opportunities offered to boys and girls. It could be due also to social stereotypes, because people believe that boys should do mathematics and girls should do reading. Well, then there is a gender gap in mathematics. In line with these arguments, Guizot and his co-authors in 2008, they noted that there is a lower gender gap in more gender-equal countries. So the paper that I will present today is in line with the second interpretation. So no, it's not natural. So, sorry. What do we do in this paper? So we take advantage of the socialist institution as a natural experiment that produced a more gender-equal culture. And we ask the question, is there a smaller gender gap in the former socialist countries as opposed to the Western countries? But since it would be hard to conclude on anything if I was to compare, for instance, Ukraine to France, because I'm French, we use here the division of Germany as a natural experiment, because the entire Germany shares the same history, the same culture. They have been Prussia for a long time, and so there is not this issue of history and culture. And the division of Germany, we argue, can be thought as a natural experiment. It was divided in 1949 based on occupation zones, so arguably exogenous, and it lasted for 41 years. And during the division, two completely different sets of institutions that I describe in the next slide were applied. And our research question is whether the gender gap in mathematics is smaller in East Germany after the reunification, so under the same institutions, as compared to West Germany. So as I said, the division of Germany can be thought as a natural experiment. So first, before the division, we collected data that I won't show today because it's a bit too long to explain, but we collected data from statistical yearbook on structural differences between East and West Germany, and we show that there is no structural economic differences between East and West Germany. We show that the share of women working in the labor force is approximately the same in East and West Germany, that the share of girls enrolled in higher education is approximately the same in East and West Germany. Then comes the division in 1949, and two completely different sets of institutions are applied. In the German Democratic Republic, so in East Germany, employment was made a universal right and a duty for women as well as men. Special attention was devoted to the compatibility between fertility and employment, and as a result, a large network of kindergarten was developed in East Germany. And in the meantime, in the Federal Republic of Germany, in West Germany, There were irregular school times, so that someone had to come and pick up the children, and most often it was women, and so women could not work full-time. There were fiscal disincentives to women's work. In the law, until 1977, it was stated, and I quote, "The wife is responsible for running the household. She has a right to be employed as far as this is compatible with her marriage and family duties." So it was clearly emphasized that the job of a woman was her household, then her work. And after reunification in 1990, well, the Western system quickly spread to the eastern part and took over institution. So to provide illustration on what I just said, we collected data from statistical yearbooks from 1963 to 1991 on the diverging trend of women's participation in the labor market during the German division. In the dashed line, so the dashed line is East Germany, and the solid line is West Germany. So what do we see? Well, in 1960, it was approximately the same, around 35% of working women. Then the trends quickly diverged, and East Germany nearly reached 50% of women working, whereas West Germany remained stable around 30%. So to investigate whether the gender gap in mathematics is smaller in East versus West Germany, we use two data sets. The first one is the German Socio-Economic panel. It is a survey run at the scale of Germany on 20,000 adults and 3,500 teenagers. There is a question on mathematics, on self-assessed math grade, which is the following. Can you remember your last report card? What grade did you have in mathematics? It was coded on a 1-6 scale, 1 being very good to 6 being deficient, and we recorded it on a 0-1 scale, 1 being very good or good, and 0 being otherwise. And in addition to this survey, we also use the PISA survey run in 2003 in Germany. So this survey is quite famous. PISA is quite famous around the world. It is known for comparing the performance of students in a lot of countries around the world. But in addition to these international comparisons, countries had the opportunity and still have the opportunity to run PISA at a national level on a much more bigger sample. And this is the data that we use. So we have 25,000 observations on 15 years old. And why do we pick 2003? Well, because 2003, there is a thorough assessment of mathematics skill. It's the year of mathematics. And after, well, it was not done anymore because Germany had very bad performance, actually. And the outcomes we have in this survey are the following: self-assessed mathematics grades, objective test scores, because in PISA, students take tests. And we've got also a question on subjective attitudes towards mathematics. So econometric specification to investigate is pretty straightforward. We regress the math score of an individual on a set of variables. The most important variable being whether the individual is a female, a woman, whether the individual lives in East Germany, and whether the individual lives in East Germany and is a female. So we expect gamma 1 to be negative and significant. This will reflect the gender gap in mathematics. And our test is about gamma 2. If it is positive and significant, it will mean that the gender gap in mathematics is narrowed in East Germany after reunification. And we restrict our sample to individuals born in Germany, and we drop Berlin because we cannot distinguish East and West. So let's start with the results. So this is the results for the German Socio-Economic panel on the self-assessed math grades for adults over 18 at the time of reunification. So this is people who were born before 1971. And what do we see? Well, we see clearly that women here, they report being less good in mathematics than men. In East Germany, people report being better on average than in West Germany. And this is the test. Here, the third line, the gender gap in mathematics in East Germany is narrowed by 5 percentage points against 7 percentage points, and it actually closes completely the gender gap in mathematics that was observable in West Germany. Turning to the teenagers, so panel A is restricted to JSOEP, it's about 17 years old, and panel B is the same question in PISA, it's about 15 years old. And what do we see? Well, we see a similar picture. women, girls at that age, report being less good in mathematics here, but not in East Germany. This completely offset this. And it is the same on 15 years old in Pisa. This completely offsets this. So, but this is self-assessed math grades, and well, based on this evidence, teenagers report being, there is no gender gap in self-assessed math grades in East Germany, and there is one in West Germany. Then turning to Pisa, I take question after, I think. Then turning to Pisa, we've got 5 categories in Pisa for the year 2003. We've got space and shape, relationship and change, uncertainty, quantity, problem solving. So it's different type of mathematics skills that are assessed. And the average grade is normalized at 500. So turning to the results, each column here represents a category, and the first column is the average. So what do we see? Well, first looking at the first line here, there is a gender gap in mathematics in almost any of the topics, but in almost in all the topics, but in almost every of the topics, there is this gender gap is narrowed in East Germany. And the only topic for which it's not narrowed is the space and shape category. And it's actually quite remarkable because the space and shape category is thought, is considered by researchers to be the one where the gender gap in mathematics is the most grounded in nature, the most resilient, the hardest one to move. And here we can only acknowledge that the socialist episode has transformed, has narrowed the gender gap for softer topics, but for the hardest one, well, not so much, 13 years after. Then turning to subjective attitudes, well, we've got also 5 categories: attitude, confidence, stress, enjoyment, methods. A lot of questions are asked to students. As an example of question, there is this one. Do you agree with the following statement? They ask, I often worry that it will be difficult for me in mathematics classes. Grade your answer on a scale from 1 to 4, 1 being I agree very much, 4 being I disagree completely. And what do we find? Well, here we find a similar picture. Girls on average report being less confident, more stressed, taking less pleasure in mathematics. Only in East Germany, this gap is narrowed. And turning to the last outcome, well, competitiveness, it is quite interesting, this outcome actually, because a lot of people believe that one reason for which girls underperform in mathematics is because they lack the competitive spirit that characterizes men. And as such, there is a paper by Niederle and Westerlund entitled Do Girls Shy Away from Competition? That believes that the lack of competitiveness causes the gender gap in mathematics. And here, what do we see? Well, we see that girls on average do report being less competitive for each of these questions. Do you like being the best? Do you like to outperform the competition? But only in East Germany, well, once more time, the gap is narrowed. And turning to for whom the gap is narrowed, well, we've plotted this graph. So here on the x-axis, you've got the score, your mathematics score in the distribution of all the scores. And on the y-axis, the gender gap in competitiveness. So what do we see? Well, the gender gap in competitiveness is the biggest for individuals who are around the median of the scores, who are average. Well, why? Because this is where there is the highest level of uncertainty about your level. And this is where actually in East Germany, well, compared East Germany to West Germany, the gap has been narrowed the most. So finally, well, we checked, we're comparing West and East Germany. So we checked that the results are not driven by school differences, teaching style, economic condition, religious orientation, because in the PISA survey there are questions about how people teach, to the teacher, how people teach, how is the school, how is it different. And we checked all this, and this was not, well, it does not seem with the data that we have to be a significant factor behind our results. And finally, we also ran some extensions. So the analysis that I just showed was narrowed to the case of East versus West Germany, but we extended the analysis to all of the European countries, comparing Eastern and Western countries. So we had similar findings in PISA Europe, comparing the Eastern countries to the Western ones. We also looked at the International Mathematical Olympiad. It's a competition where, at the international level where countries send their most brilliant students, and we found that Eastern countries send relatively more girls. And we also looked at chess competition, which is related to mathematical skills, and we found that the gender gap is lower among Eastern countries. And this was what just descriptive. So finally, in this paper, I believe the socialist episode first has exerted long-lasting multi-directional effects on a lot of things, on women, and especially on women's expectations, self-confidence, and choices. There have been previous papers that I did not summarize here, but that exist, that have shown that labor values were stronger for women in the former JDR, so in former East Germany, as opposed to West Germany. And here in this paper, we extend the results from this paper to the gender gap in mathematics. We found that the gender gap in mathematics was narrowed in East Germany as compared to West Germany, and as such, we believe that the gender gap in math is partly due to stereotypes, and that it can be undone by institutions, because if socialist countries managed to do it at a time where gender gaps were much bigger than today, well, we believe that today more could be done. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Quentin. And now, please, Maksym, your discussion, maybe straight to comments.
Okay, so I was in a bit difficult situation here because the paper is really well executed, and it's really hard to come with some meaningful comments. But I'll try. I found some issues there. Can you please put maybe my presentation, the short one, discussion? Okay. Well, oops. Yeah. No, it's not mine. The other one. Другую, пожалуйста. Okay. No, the other one. There are two. I mean. Okay, so, well, it will take forever. So my comments are as follows. First of all, it's a really good paper, right? I like, it's provocative, right? Because there are different stereotypes, right? Eastern Germany, it's a builder of socialism. Western Germany, it's a wife and a mother, first of all. So it's really cool to see how these two different, right? How stereotypes matter. So the questions that I have, the comments that I have is, the first question is about this validity test, right? So you spend quite a lot of time on comparing Eastern and Western Germany, but for some reason you take 1933, which kind of strange because it's 6 years before the Second World War, right? So we're not sure how it was different in 1939. And second, again, are we sure that the damage during the World War II was the same in Eastern and Western Germany, right? Again, there is no evidence. So it's like, if you think about 1949 when it was divided and compare it to 1933, it's quite a long time and the war was in the middle. So, I would either try to make some maybe later data if possible, or at least make some comments. And also related to this, you mentioned that it's well established in the literature, this validity test, that it's actually the same kind of countries in terms of the level. So the question is, why do you do these divisions then, right? Why do you reconfirm it, right? So I'll try then to read from my, from my presentation on the phone. Yeah. So second comment is the ordering, right? So you first discuss German Socio-Economic panel, and then you discuss PISA, but then when you go to results, you do it vice versa, which is kind of strange, right? I mean, if you first introduce German Socio-Economic panels, then probably you should also report results for it first, right? Because currently the order is different. Yeah, it will be really helpful if you could provide some descriptive table or figure which compares subjective and objective math scores in PISA, right? Because you have both of them. So if you want to validate the use of subjective indicators, it's good to see how they relate on a graph, right? Because you have both of them for teenagers, so it's good if you can show this evidence. Concerning the quantile regression, again, there is a standard Volt test, right, which is used to actually test if there is a difference between quantiles, right? You claim there is a difference, but without a formal test, I'm not buying this, right? So there must be some formal test. This section about religious orientation is not, I'm not sure why it's there, right? Because you don't present any formal results. I mean, there is a subsection in appendix, which is kind of incomplete, right? So if you put it there, then provide some evidence or, maybe describe it better. My main concern is that you have really interesting question, but you don't really explore this PISA data for Europe, right? Because this is a comparative economics, right? The case of Germany is very interesting, but you also have East and Western Germany, but you also have Eastern and Western Europe countries, right, in PISA. And the question here, you spend like half a page or maybe just one page on this, which is kind of, you want to put more there. You want to sell it better, you want to, because you have the data, right? Maybe you can add some maps, maybe you can add some quantile regressions, maybe you can, do some extra work, because then it will make the paper really general. But again, overall, I find, and final comment, you connect sort of the number of people who know mathematics to economic growth, which is good. But it would also help to think about whether mathematical skills help to smooth the transition process, right? If you have more mathematics, because again, we're talking about transition, we talk about this comparative studies, so it's good to bring more discussion, more motivation, right, to make it more general. But again, final comment, it's a really good paper, right? So it's, I tried to add some things which I don't understand, but maybe it was an earlier version, so maybe you can just address them. So that's all. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Maybe you would like to address, and then we will have time for, let's say, 1-2 questions,
Okay. Hello again. So thank you very much for this comment. It's very useful. So just briefly, I answer them. So at first you say, why do we focus on 2003? Because of data availability, actually. This survey, this PISA survey in Germany, it was run in 2000, 2003, 2006 only. 2006, it was said by the OECD to be not credible because they cheated to get better, well, there is no German here, but they cheated to get better, apparently, better scores. 2000, it's not the year of mathematics, so there's just one outcome that we can explore. In 2003, there are the subjective attitudes, the different topics, and this is why. The damage of World War II, I agree with you, it's bad for us, but then the subjective and objective score, definitely. Religious orientations, I don't know either. We put it there because we had a question, but it deserves to be treated better, I think. And East versus West Europe, why? Well, I think the claim of the paper is that it is causal. So when we compare in East and Western Europe, always people may think, oh, you're comparing two types of things that are not comparable. And we're just putting there for subjective evidence, and there has been work on Eastern Europe already also. So the contribution is really about East Germany. Thank you.
No. Okay. All right, so we've got time for, let's say, 2 questions. All right, let me.
Yeah, hey, thanks for the presentation. So you already said that for Germany, the data over time is not available or is not good. But then I was wondering, what happens to the gap over time? So if you compare data point in, say, 1992, right after, say, 2005, 2000, whatever, 10. So in the German case, apparently you cannot do that. But if you did it for West versus Eastern Europe, then I was wondering, how this, maybe, is everybody converging back to the Western, values in the sense of gender gap, or what's your hunch on that? Thanks.
I hope it is converging, but for Germany it's not possible, unfortunately. for Europe, yes, we could do it. I don't think it has been done, and I will do it, and I hope it will work. But also the issue is that you know, a lot happened after in most countries, so you know, it's hard to, maybe it goes down, then it goes up. We don't, I don't know how it will play.
Yes, thanks for your fascinating research. So I have a question about institutions and culture, because you speak a lot about institutions, about this institutional shock that changed the landscape of the labor markets and incentivized girls and women. But then you also spoke about the fact of reunification, and that now basically we don't have these old institutions anymore. So my question is about what are the mechanisms of transition of these beliefs, attitudes? Why would girls still share these ideas, or mothers or men share this idea that their daughters have to study math, even though they don't have these institutions around anymore? Is this about culture, and how would you test it or disentangle culture from institutions? Thanks.
I think, well, you know, transition, shock happened, world is destroyed, and one Germany again. But the people stay, the people that were living in East Germany and West Germany, and the people, they don't change their way of thinking, so maybe, then I agree with you, it's a bit hard to, you know, show it with statistics and things like that, but it is the mechanism that we have in mind that adults just maybe teach their children how to behave, and also children see how their adults behave, and they just want to imitate them. So it's, we believe that institutions change the culture, and the culture remains, actually. But I don't know if it answers partially. Okay.
Okay, the last question, please.
Thank you. Leonid Khomyakov, freelancer, PhD in economics. Do you think there is existing, it's called by Stanislavski, sверхзадача, the overtie between this trend to increasing of math education everywhere, in, say, among girls, and the not very clearly articulated idea by Putin that in future the state that could provide the upper level of artificial intellect will have the power over the world. Thank you. If you understand what
I think I did not understand fully the question because there was a term that was not English at the beginning. So maybe someone can.
All right. The way how I understood, you know, maybe what type of environment should we do in order to have equal scores for girls and boys? Maybe we can go back to DDR, German Democratic Republic, you know, style, to you know.
Okay. So what type of environment should we do, or should we put back communism? Like, no, I don't think so. I think. Well, the claim of the paper is not that communism was better than in what was happening in West Germany. It's just that there were things in East Germany that could be generalized to other countries. Not everything was horrible. There were like kindergarten, and it was possible for women to work in East Germany, and it was much less possible in West Germany. So I think this is what could be done, and what shows this example is that it is possible to do it. Yeah.
All right. Yes. Thank you very much. You know, and let's say our next speaker, Maksym Obrizan, and let's say he's going to talk about very interesting topic: happiness of children.
Children and happiness, right? So what can be more interesting? So again, this is joint work with Tom Coupe, who unfortunately left the Kyiv School of Economics for New Zealand. So So why does it matter, right? So you know there is a huge literature on transition gap in adult happiness. What it means is that if you compare similar adults in transition countries versus developed countries, typically adults in transition countries, they are less happy. And again, this is statistically economically significant result. There was a number of important contributions why it might happen. One of the most important, of course, is Guriev and Zhuravskaya. So they provide, they talk about things like restructuring, they talk about things like deterioration of the quality of public goods and so on. But if you look at the most recent data, there are some arguments that actually this gap has closed, right? So there is no any more difference between adults' happiness in developed and transition countries. However, if you look at children, there is no data. There is virtually no data about this possible transition gap, which is actually quite natural to expect. Right, given there was a lot of transformation, given that the economic well-being worsened. So, and that's exactly what we want to do in this paper, right? So we want to look at transition countries and developed countries, and we want to compare, right, if there is any evidence of this gap. So why does it matter? So apparently there is a very important paper by Mankey, Romer, and Well, who showed that education is one of the key ingredients for explaining cross-country differences in income. And there is a number of more recent papers which talk about the connection between sort of happiness and performance in school. So apparently, what we are trying to show here is that if there is this happiness gap, maybe these children in transition countries, maybe they don't have motivation to study, and maybe, again, this has some implications for future economic growth, right? So this is kind of a long picture why it matters. So the research question here are as follows. So first of all, we want to test for the transition gap, right? We are kind of probably the first who do it in the literature. Then we want to compare also adult and children life satisfaction, right? For comparable countries, for comparable years. To see how they relate, right? Again, being able to talk about the previous papers about sort of adult transition gap. And finally, we also want to identify potential correlates, right? Why this gap is present. So the primary data for our talk is called health behavior and in school-age children. It's a pretty old data set which started in 1983, 1984. What's good about this is that they started to add transition countries as early as 1985, right? So they added Hungary, and then they added Czech Republic, Estonia, Lithuania, Russia, and Slovakia in 1993-94. And currently, they have even more data, even more transition countries. So we managed to obtain this earlier data, but unfortunately, given the difference in the composition of the sample, of the questions and answers, we only used it for robustness checks, right? So our main data set is actually the same health behaviors data, but the three most recent waves which are publicly available, which is 2001, 2005, and 2009. Well, looking at the numbers, you see that we have quite a large sample. We have 11 transition countries, and we have 18 non-transition countries, and overall we have more than 450,000 observations. So it's a pretty big data set, and it's 10 years, almost a decade of the data. And again, to avoid any results to be driven by sample composition, we only look at the countries that appeared in all three waves, right? Because otherwise, it can be driven by some changes in the sample composition. It appears again that not many papers have used this data. So these are the two papers that we found, but they either don't use all available data, or they don't use all of the available covariates, or they don't ask a question about transition versus non-transition countries. So again, that's the novel feature of the data. So this is the sample of the countries, right? So the left part is developed countries. The right part is transition countries, which we use. In addition, we also used PISA data for the most recent year, for 2014, because HBSC is not available for this year yet, not publicly available. And again, since we do comparison with adults, we add World Value Survey European Value Study, because again, these are standard, pretty well-established surveys for adult data. Right, and of course we add some additional papers from Guriev and Zhuravskaya, like macroeconomic variables, democracy rating, and also media freedom, things like that. So again, pretty standard in this adult happiness gap literature. Okay. Before we go to this kind of subjective evaluation, of course, it's a good question to ask about objective evaluation, things like, economic well-being of the family, unemployment, things like that. And again, typical literature talks about U-shaped, right? So right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had, like, all these things going down, right? So there is more unemployment and things like that. But gradually it starts to build up, right? So this is kind of similar picture will actually show up in our study for subjective measure. So this is the first empirical result I want to show you. So here we have average happiness in transition and non-transition countries, right? So if you look at this column, you have transition countries. If you look at this column, you have non-transition countries, developed countries. And apparently, you observe, first of all, that happiness has been increasing in transition countries. So we are talking here about 0 to 10 scale, right? So 0, it's worst possible life. 10, it's the best possible life. And again, this is country average unweighted, right? And if you compare these numbers with developed countries, typically they have higher happiness level for children, right? So again, this is our motivation to do this study. Next figure, we present the country averages for life satisfaction of adults and life satisfaction of children, right? And here what you can see is that, first of all, the life satisfaction of adults is much more spread, right? So it's lower and there is more variation in it, right? And children, as you can guess, children are always children, they're always happy, right? So there is less variation and they are on average happier. And also if you look at the yellow versus red points, yellow points stand for transition countries, red points stand for developed countries. So again, there is some evidence that happiness level in developed countries, for adults at least, is higher. Okay, so we also ran some simple regressions. So this regression, it's just just for reference. It's like 70 observations, pretty small ones. But the message here is that there is very weak connection between adult and children life satisfaction, right? So you might have situation in a country when parents are unhappy, right? But children are still happy, right? Which is kind of interesting. Right. So let me now talk about the empirical specification. So I use standard difference and difference model, in which we have a dummy variable for transition countries. We have 3 periods, which is 2001, 2005, 2009. And we have, of course, this cross term, which interacts the transition dummy with the year dummy. And when we run our models, we actually tried for different specification, because of course one can argue that there might be some endogeneity in terms of some of these variables, right? So we want to show that these results are robust in 4 different specifications. So we start with a very basic difference in difference model, in which we have just difference in difference dummies and demographics like age and girl, dummy variable for a girl. Then we gradually add health variables. There is a question is, do you have a headache? Do you have backache? Then we gradually add family wealth things like, do you have a car in the family? Do you have your own bedroom? Do you go hungry to bed? It's like all indicators of family wealth. Then we add finally these macroeconomic variables, right, which are sort of again, standard in the literature, like GDP per capita, unemployment, media freedom, things like that. Well, I can say right here that all our results are robust in these 4 different models, which kind of tells us that it's not driven by endogeneity or anything like that. So now let's start with the results. So first result that we observe is that if you look at 2001, our base year, there is indeed lower happiness for children in transition countries like Ukraine, right? And the level of this like transition gap, it's relatively small compared to Guriev and Zhuravskaya, right? So it's like something like about 0.2, 0.3. Compared to 1.4, 1.2 in Zhuravskaya and Guriev. But again, we remember from this first pictures that there is less variation in children's happiness, right? So, you know, and it's still statistically significant, and it's quite large in the magnitude, right, in relative terms, because it's comparable to, for example, to reporting a health problem, right? So if you live in a transition country, then your happiness is lower by the same magnitude as if you had, for example, a headache or something like this. Right. So, of course, second question we are interested in is, you know, we have the base year. How did it change over time, right? What was the evolution of this happiness gap? And similarly to previous papers for adult life satisfaction, we actually find that by 2009, this gap has closed, right? And it becomes kind of insignificant at 14%. You know, apparently, judging from this, you know, there is some kind of similar trends as for the adults. Okay, the next slide that I want to discuss is actually other determinants of happiness. Of course, you know, in order to avoid this omitted variables bias, we incorporated many other variables which have been found to affect happiness. So, you know, older people and girls, women are less happy, you know, which is similar for adults. Then we also find that health problems reduce life satisfaction from 0.3 to 0.4 on these terms. There is also negative effect of relative poverty, right? So if family has some problems with, you know, with economic well-being, like, you know, if a child goes hungry to bed, it reduces his or her life satisfaction by, you know, 0.5, 0.6 points. And again, this is like on 0 to 10 scale, right? So yeah, so it's quite large. And also, not having vacation also has a strong effect. When we come to macroeconomic variables, they actually appear to be insignificant for the most part. Probably again because children don't really that much. I mean, children don't go on the job market, right? They don't look for a job, you know. So they don't really care about this thing. So the only exception here is unemployment, right? Which is, you know, higher unemployment affects happiness sort of in positive way, which is kind of strange, right? But the effect is very small quantitatively, so we think it might be some you know, problem maybe with the data. Right. So again, this is the base year, right? Next thing we did, we can also look at different age groups, right? Because our sample consists of 3 age cohorts. 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, and 11-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 15-year-olds, right? And given that we have more than 150,000 observations in each sample, it's possible to look separately for each age cohort. And what we found here is that the results of this transition gap in happiness are primarily driven by younger children, right? 11-year-old and 13-year-old, because 15-year-olds, they don't have transition gap to begin with, and then, you know, there is no change over time. So apparently 15-year-olds, they have some other problems to think about, you know, maybe like relationships with the opposite gender and stuff like that. But for younger children, like 11-year-old, 13-year-old, there is this gap, and this gap, again, gradually closing over time. Now we are coming back to extended sample. Remember that we have also collected earlier data from 3 earlier waves, right? From as early as 1985-86. The problem is this data that many questions are missing, right? So for example, we don't have questions about family wealth. Second problem is that we don't have so many countries, right? So relative to the main sample, we have only a handful of countries, right? Because they did not start participating in this survey earlier. And again, we try to preserve the balanced sample. And coming back to the question of the question about happiness, it's also a different one, right? So again, it's only kind of a robustness check, right? So we don't really take these results as comparable to the main results. And in these robustness checks, we also find a similar picture, right? So basically, again, there is an initial gap in happiness, which gradually closes over time, right? The only question is that we have 2 different base years, right? But again, it's not exactly the same sample as the old one. Okay, so conclusions. What have we learned? So first of all, to study happiness in children is important because happiness relates to performance at school, and education relates to economic growth, right? So again, this is the link which drives our results. Second, we find indeed that children are on average happier than parents, or than older adults. But we also find a similar transition gap in children's life satisfaction as was found for the older adults. But again, given that there is less variation, this gap is also smaller. Nevertheless, again, this gap is significant, right? It's comparable to reporting health problems. And finally, we found that this gap has closed or has been closing, as transition period, has been ongoing, right? So again, thank you for attention. I'm done. If you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maksym. And due to particular reason, I'm also discussing this paper. Let's say, I don't know about slides, but in general, main conclusion, I think what I got from, let's say, from this paper, actually, I will not repeat, like structure, but what I like the most, transition is over. So like this title, that's post-transition economy. So like, let's say if, well, I always support transition is over because when we are moving from point A to point B, so that we are in transition. We are not moving, I think, in general. So I move forward to, let's say, such suggestions. I enjoy reading in general, but let's say when I was reading, I wanted to know a little bit more about, let's say, data, like how many, let's say, observations from which countries, like just to get feeling, what are you operating with. Let's say another point, let's say empirical strategy, I assume children's happiness is quite difficult to model. And so let's say what exactly determinants, what do have, let's say, type of expectations for those variables? That would be great to have. Okay, that's particularly important because, let's say, I browse about happiness of children in UK in 2017, and what I found in the sample of 16 countries, they are number 13. So, like, and it's kind of not transition, and UK was worse than Estonia, Poland, and Turkey. Like, so like, maybe there is more complicated mechanism behind children's happiness. Well, obviously, we can always find, I hate this type of comment for myself, like, because there will be always, let's say, omitted variables, other things. I give, like some measures of family background, school background, and maybe there are already ready-to-use variables that you can somehow incorporate into your analysis. Another thing I would a little bit restructure, because currently, let's say, your paper based on your presentation has 2 parts. One is about country-level estimates, another about individual. Subjectively, being micro person, like, I don't really like aggregating data. I understand that that was the only way how you can, let's say, compare parents' satisfaction, let's say, adult satisfaction and children's satisfaction. But maybe go into a, let's say, lower level, like maybe country-specific data sets, like OLMS, like you can kind of build story between parents and children. All right, econometricians always ask questions like, Quentin before had linear probability model to the best of my knowledge. Well, I am more towards ordinal logic and results from OLMS. When I run, let's say, children's satisfaction on parent satisfaction, linear probability model kind of got significant results, coefficient 0.38, but running all logic results was, like 3 stars. So maybe that's the way where you would like to move. All right, and a number of minor issues, but very good paper, very promising. I really enjoyed reading it. And now we've got, how many? Few minutes for questions.
Can I address your comments?
Oh,
okay.
Sorry.
Because I want to, I want to answer maybe some of these questions. So thank you so much for bringing these questions. So we definitely need to add descriptives, that's for sure. Thank you for pointing this out. So we will add descriptives. Second, about the family variable school environment. Again, it's a very good point. We'll add them for robustness checks. We do have some of the family well-being variables, but maybe we also can add this question about is your family well off? That's a good one. Concerning the two parts, again, it's a paper written by two people, right? So I might, to some extent, agree with you, but again, maybe it's a good if you have sort of a perspective with sort of the countries. Again, we don't make any causal claims, 73 observations, country level data, of course, we're not serious there, it's just for comparison. Concerning the logic, it's also the one thing that we plan to do, and we will do it, but we would like to keep for the paper, actually, the linear probability model, because I think there is a paper by Lechner who said, this diff and diff is not really suited for nonlinear models, right? So it's we might have some kind of econometric issues there, but we will do it for the robustness checks. That's a good one. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
I'm curious, so it's very interesting. Thank you for a very nice paper, by the way. Very interesting that you teased out the effects by the cohort, by the age of the children. Do you have any chance to look if there is homogeneity or heterogeneity when you look at different countries? Like, is there like pockets of very unhappy children, parents, and that is driving the results? Or
you mean by age cohort or?
No, by countries.
This might be a bit difficult because we have 29 countries, right? And I suspect that there is no. We can check that. We will check that. But I think there will probably no such a big difference. There are some outliers probably. So you're afraid of outliers, kind of, or?
Well, like UK type, or a country because of climate or something else that there is like.
We do have so in this country level specifications, we do have included country fixed effects, and again, this transition gap coefficient is the same, but apparently it loses significance. But again, we have only 73 observations, so maybe we can repeat it for individual regressions as well. Yeah, and then see if it's still there.
All right, any more questions? Oh, sorry.
I have a short question. Is it possible to compare happiness among siblings? Children in the same household?
That's a good one. I'm not sure if we have any in this data. I have to check. That's a good one. Because then they will be, but then there will be no transition gap, right? Because you don't have like one sibling in. You don't mean twins. You mean siblings. How they change over time. I'll check. I'll check if there is a family indicator, because I'm not sure about this. Yeah, that's a good one.
All right. Any more questions? Yeah. Then thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, and the last presentation in this session, Lena Besedina will tell us about let's say, mothers and children.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. This paper is co-authored with two researchers from the World Bank. And actually, this paper is a result of a short-term assignment for the World Bank, which looked at the fertility trends in Russia. The motivation for this research was to basically try, for the World Bank, try to devise some policy in order to improve the fertility and demographic situation in Russia and other countries. So here this graph shows you the total fertility rate in selected Central European countries and CIS. And as you can see in all of them, even though the trends are more or less improving, still all these countries are far from the replacement rate, which is 2 per woman. Okay. Actually, people try to explain why total fertility is low. There are different theories, and I will touch about the economic aspects, since I'm an economist. However, the two major reasons could be that people either do not have children or they have fewer children. And actually, if you look at this graph, here you see also different European countries for which data were available. Also, there is Russia in here. This is the cohort. This is not total fertility rate. This is cohort fertility rate for women who completed already their fertility decisions, born around 1965. So basically, there is no clear part and where you can say that it's childlessness that drives the total fertility in country, or it's a low number of children. Actually, if you look at Russian case, clearly it's not childlessness, but prevalence of families with one child. And the next graph gives more kind of motivation for our paper, is that if you look at the aspirations of women to have children, so for many women, so for majority of countries, on average, people want to have 2 children in the family. So this is a gray bar, while actually they have smaller numbers than 2. Okay, so there is a gap clearly between aspirations and realizations. So in this paper, actually, we concentrate on the parity progression from 1 child to the 2nd child. We use Russian longitudinal data, several waves of them. I'll talk about them in more detail later. And we find that work-life balance is an important determinant of this parity progression, even controlling for other factors. So this is a standard presentation outline. I will talk about theoretical background and related literature. Then I'll talk about empirical strategy and data. We'll discuss results and conclude with some remarks and venues for further research. Okay, so economic theory on fertility decisions try basically to explain this decision as the economic decision making. It's based on seminal paper of Gary Becker, who looked at children as home-produced goods. So basically, in this framework, a household's demand for children will depend primarily on 3 factors. Income, so children are assumed to be normal goods, so economists will know what it is, right? So the price of children, which is the opportunity cost, and there are many, many factors which will affect opportunity cost, and I will talk about them quickly. And also about some endogenous or like inherited preferences of people towards children. Okay, so definitely these factors, the factors that affect these 3 other factors will determine the childbearing pattern and will affect fertility decisions. So there is a vast literature which looks at the determinants of fertility decisions. There are papers which look in general about the kind of probability of having a child. Also, there are papers which look from, as our paper, moving from 1 child to higher order births. So income has ambiguous effect on the decision to have another child. So actually, this will contradict the normality assumption of children. So also, education has ambiguous effect. So in some countries, it's found to increase the probability of having more children, while in Russia, actually, there was a paper by Chirkova in 2013 which showed that additional schooling actually does not seem to contribute to fertility. Okay, and also the age at the first birth is important, and as this increases the opportunity cost of a child, because these women are usually in their career. Okay, so there are papers on to which our paper is related the most. It's about the work-life balance, and actually they show that countries which have better work balance for women. So women can actually combine work and family life. They have higher fertility, and so do not actually face problems with the aging of population, or the problems are not as severe. And one of the factors from this work-life balance is a stable employment, also consistent with our results. And a different childcare provisions. Another stream of literature which we actually add, this is a new stream. This comes from psychology, which actually looks at the psychological factors which affect the parity from one child to another one. So people look at the parenthood experience. And there are studies which find that if you had a negative experience with your first child, definitely you will be less likely to want and have another child. Okay. So the hypothesis that we test in this paper is actually that factors which affect parents' preferences, they will affect primarily aspirations or desire to have a second child, while factors that affect the cost of children, opportunity cost, will primarily affect the actual decision and actual realization of the second child. So empirical strategy, we use Probit model. So we have two actually variables, dependent variables. One is the probability of desiring a second child, and another one is basically a transition probability from one child to a second child by the next wave of the survey. Okay. And we hypothesize that the sets of correlates are similar for two, with differences in their importance. Okay, the empirical model looks like this. So actually factors are grouped not by income, opportunity cost, and preferences, but more related, kind of more, which is used in the literature. So the first group of factors includes women and first child characteristics. And here we will use two things about labor market status, whether mother is working and whether mother is working for more than 3 years at the same place. This is our indicator of stable employment. Then we also have a group of variables which include partners' characteristics, whether this woman is actually married or not, then partner's years of education and his labor market status. Also, we include household characteristics because it's found in the literature that definitely well-off households are likely to have to desire more children. Though the high end of the income distribution, probably the relationship is reversed. And then we also have one family policy variable, which is represent the childcare provision, and actually is a number of days that the child is in daycare arrangement. And it also, all our regressions include round and region fixed effects. This is especially important for Russia, since Russia is very heterogeneous, and there are regions which differ in terms of cultural things, so this regional fixed effects actually control for these things. And the subjective well-being variables, already familiar from other presentations. So the only thing we use the coding as it is in the questionnaire, but probably it will be a good idea to recode to make it more intuitive. So here 1 is fully satisfied and 5 is non-satisfied. And following recent literature, we construct 3 variables. There is a so-called set point measure, which shows the level of happiness 2 years before the first child is born. So basically, this is a level of happiness which characterizes this person. And then we also look at the change in the subjective well-being to control for the psychological factors of parenthood experience. The first variable looks at the change from 2 years before the birth and the year of the birth, and then the second one is from 2 years from the birth and 2 years after the birth. Okay. So data, as I have mentioned, we use the Russia longitudinal monitoring survey, 2004-2012. Overall, our sample had around 3,000 women of reproductive age. Actually, it was reduced even more because we use this. We need to have data on subjective well-being 2 years prior the birth of the child. So actually, our actual sample is smaller. And also, we have some, so 11% of women in the sample reported desire to have a second child. Okay, so the next graph, quickly, this is like a, instead of descriptive statistics, shows you the gap between aspirations and realizations. Clearly, this is not troublesome because these women are young, so definitely they want more and they still have. What is troubling is probably here, this gap still remains, right? And then in this age, women just do not want any more children. So results. Our main finding is that stable employment seems to be an important factor for actually having a second child, while it does not affect the aspirations. And this is the aspirations, and the next table is the having the second child. Also, education matters for aspirations, so more educated women do want to have children, but when we look at the actual decisions, education is not an important factor. And there is a clear daughter preference, which is different from, for example, East Asian countries, where there is a son preference. So in Russia, if the first child is male, women are more likely to want and to have a second child. So they want to have daughters. And household well-being is also important for aspirations and for having a second child. What is more important is, since we wanted to contrast our paper with this subjective well-being literature, the effect of the work-life balance is still preserved, even when we include the subjective well-being factors in the regression. So here, this is for want, the two specifications, and here half. So as you can see, stable employment is still important. Another result from here is that actually your set point of happiness, or 2 years before the first child, are not important for you, for women, for their desire to have a child. However, women who were happier 2 years before the birth, they are more likely to have a second child. Remember that since we use the original scaling, negative is a good thing, actually. And here also you can see that the change in the subjective well-being does not seem to affect this desire and decision to have a second child. And this is actually in contrast to papers for other countries. Okay, let me conclude. So, our results are broadly consistent. As I said, on other determinants, with subjective well-being, our results are not consistent, but stable employment and work-life balance are found to be important for other countries as well. The important policy implication from our analysis that we want you to bring from this paper is that it's really important, in order to improve demographic situation in the country, is not actually to provide just some money to families, but actually to facilitate this returning of women into labor force, and this combination of work and life, maybe some shorter hours, part-time jobs, and so on. And what we want to do next, we want to explore the linkages between subjective well-being and other factors, and also different dimensions of subjective well-being, right? Because we only looked at life satisfaction, but there are actually other questions about satisfaction in the questionnaire which we want to explore. And also there are papers that look at that actually say that parenthood experience and work-family balance intensify each other. So we want to explore this as well. Okay, thank you. That completes my presentation.
So, thank you very much. And now, Quentin, your 5 minutes of fame.
Okay, but actually I planned this situation, so I wrote my slide. So hello again. So I will discuss your paper very briefly. I'll start by summarizing it, and then I'll go through the discussion. So this paper, it examines the correlates of Russian first-time mothers' desire and decision to have a second child. It focuses mainly on the motherhood-career trade-off. The data comes from the Russia Longitudinal Monitoring Survey. The way is from 2004 until 2012. The method is a multivariate econometric model, and the main results, I think the ones that are put forward the most, is that stable employment is positively associated with the likelihood of having a second child, but not with the desire of having a second child, and this is robust to a wide range of controls. So well, this was a very interesting to read paper. It was clear, it was precise, it was focused on a topic, it was very well documented. The context, well, I didn't know the context, and it was thoroughly explained. The inclusion of each variable was discussed and linked with the existing literature and theory. There were clear public policy implications because there is a context of low fertility rate, and there were at the end of the paper prediction of how the fertility rate would increase if stable employment would increase. But well, I think so I discussed the paper in the order of the paper. So I think the main issue is on the identification. So the paper does not claim to be causal, but at the end there is public policy implications, and if there is public policy implication, it is because well, there is a causality somewhere. So, for instance, individuals who want children may self-select into stable job, and this could be reverse causality. That's what my parents did, so I know. Also, there is a panel in the data. The data comes from a panel, and I did not really understand why it's used as a cross-section. Why there is no individual fixed effect. It could remove a lot of the endogeneity. So maybe it's because of the stable employment variable or the control, like subjective well-being controls. The stable employment variable is defined as a dummy. It equals 1 if the individual has followed the same job for the last 3 years and 0 otherwise. I think it can cause some problems to define it that way. Why? Because maybe it requires the individual to be 3 consecutive years in the panel, which may reduce a lot the sample. And plus, we don't really know if it is really the employment that is stable. Maybe the individual really likes his job, and so her job in particular. So she stays in the job. Maybe she's really good at the job, and she stays in the job. So I thought alternatively, the current employment status could be used, and it could be used in panel with fixed effect. It could be used as a switch from a situation of no employment to employment and see how it affects the results. Maybe you could compute an index of stability per job, see how many people leave the job and stay in the job. Also on the data, the period chosen is 2004 until 2012. So I was wondering why not longer. I think it's because of the variables, the availability of variables. But if it is not, why not? And also in the text, it's mentioned a sample of 5,000 observations, but we don't find them in the estimations. So about the sample, in the tables, you add controls progressively, but the sample size is reduced progressively, and it's not the same sample through the same table. So for instance, it moves from 3,000 observation until 1,700 observation in the same table. So maybe the different results are due to the different sample, and it could be interesting to reduce the sample to the final one and then add the controls. And the sample size also differs between the two outcome variables, and I was wondering how it affects the results. And finally on the results, So the paper is focused on second child, but I think it could be interesting to contrast it with first, second, and third child, especially for policy implication, because at the end you say if the stable employment rate increases, the fertility could increase this way. Well, if it affects the first and third child, it could increase it even more. Also, it was focused on women, and I thought that it takes two to make a children, and I did not really understood why there is nothing about men, because if it affects differently men and women, maybe for policy implication it does not have the same relevance, and so I thought it could be interesting to add a table on men. And finally, on the time perspective, you've got several years in the sample, so it could be interesting to break the results by year, but I think it would give a too narrow sample. But what could be more interesting is to break before 2007 and after 2007, because at the beginning of the article there is a lot of talk about the big policy in 2007 that affect fertility, and maybe, I don't know, maybe the results change before after this policy, and maybe it's connected, the main results are connected to the policy. So this is it.
Thank you very much, Quentin, and maybe...
Many comments, so I'll try. I'll start from the end. We are not focused on the policy, so I agree that it's an important question. There are papers which look at this. We control for this policy because we have round fixed effects. So definitely, if there is a change coming from this policy, it's controlled for. Year by year, I don't think we will have enough observations to do this. Men versus women, because the fertility decision, either you talk about women or household. Men do not make fertility decisions because they cannot realize them. So that's the simple answer. So I agree that looking at the household, but that would make sense. But we included partner characteristics. I didn't discuss them here. They can what? Yeah, wanting, yes. Yes, I agree, but not actually having them. First, second, yes, the motivation, we wanted to look at this first order transition because it's actually in Russia, as I showed on the one of the first graphs, there is a big share of families with one child. So actually, how to move this families into two children, that's probably the concern for Russian policymakers. That's why we concentrated on this, but I agree other orders are also important. Sample composition, yes, I admit this is a thing which also bothers me when I look at the table, so I think we will repolish and make a unified sample. With stable employment, I'm not sure I got your comment. Just being employed, we have this variable, currently working, which doesn't seem to be affecting either desired or desire or a realization. So it's actually to be in stable employment, which is important, and this is consistent. So I don't think we have any index of job stability. So that's why we saw that being 3 years somewhere, probably, if you're there, it's more or less stable, especially if you look at the countries in transition like Ukraine, Russia, so people move a lot around jobs now, not before. What else? Panel dimension, yes, very valid comment, thank you. And indigeneity, so this is something which we need to address. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Elena. And any questions? Yes, please.
You mentioned that you controlled for different regions. I was wondering, did you have any difference between more rural and more urban regions?
Yeah, we controlled, but actually due to there is a correlation between the variables. So the stata drops rural, urban in many specifications. So we had this control, but when it was actually there, it was not statistically important. So I think regional effects are important because Russia, if you look at Tatarstan, definitely this is a completely different story than Moscow and regions closer to Ukraine.
Right, thank you very much. Any other questions?
Please, what do you mean opportunity cost under the decision of having a second child? Thank you.
Opportunity cost, as a definition says, this is the value of the best alternative. So instead of having a child and not working, so the person can either study or work. Actually, usually it's work. So the opportunity cost will be related to the work opportunities, right? Because taking care of children takes your time, so takes from your, even if women are working, probably they cannot work in full and cannot really reach some ladders in career. Though we have examples of very good combinations for some women, yes.
I heard in Germany there is a special policy for child care in first months, like a special kit, like a box where a child can sleep, and diapers. And another policy is that men also can have a vacation for child care. Are these parameters affect? Thank you.
Yes, literature finds that definitely different policies affect the decision. However, there was a paper which was on the slide, but I didn't have time to really mention, which looked at the maternity leave, at the length of maternity leave, and showed that the length does not affect. So in countries like in Ukraine, we have 3 years, so actually it's not very productive. While countries which have lower, so it's actually the focus for the policymakers, it seems like it should be on really enabling women to work successfully and also have family. Because women now have ambition, so they want to stay at home and just raise children, okay?
All right, any more questions? No questions? Okay, I am closing the session. Thank you very much for coming.